Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage.
My goodness.
Two guys, one of which is me, Glenn Ford, and the other of
Hi,
which
Glenn.
is this guy, Mike Hutchinson, games
Hi, Mike.
designers and developers, talk about designing better miniatures games. Today, we are going to talk about turns and rounds, bright eyes, every time.
I hadn't realised you were saving up for that joke. That's brilliant. I'll drink to that.
We're going to talk about turns and rounds. For some peculiar reason, over the past 3 or 4 weeks, I have independently been approached by about 5 different designers making games without rounds in them, wondering if this is too innovative and too out there and too weird, and what does doing that mean, and what does it look like for a game, and is it a good idea? And so I've been thinking about why we have rounds particularly where they sort of interact with turns and activations, where there's simply a convenience and where they're a game mechanic. And I thought we might have a little bit of a chat about some of those ideas. So the way I think of it is units have activations, players have turns, and sort of games have rounds in a way. And it's like one of the things I said to one of the designers who sort of reached out to me, who was worried about whether having a game that didn't have rounds in it was too innovative, is Warhammer Fantasy Battle doesn't have rounds. It just has turns, and sort of my position is anything that Warhammer Fantasy Battle does can't be too innovative. that's going to be my base level.
It feels like the basic answer to why have some kind of unit of game time is that there's a conceit at the heart of all games, which is that you sort of imagine everyone's running around at the same time, but you can't resolve action simultaneously. So you have to divide the world up into something where everybody can make some movement, and then you go snip. Right, everybody can have some movement a second time and then snip. And we talked about different kinds of activation and turn structures in a previous video, and all of those are, I think, pointing at the problem of if you don't have rounds, you have to immediately deal with the problem of a Rambo, which is what I describe in my mind as when you play Infinity and you give all of your activation tokens to one guy and he charges around doing a whole sort of solo mission. And it's the camera's focused on that one guy and everyone else is frozen in time whilst Rambo goes and kills 16,000 people. And that's fine. There's nothing intrinsically wrong. That's cinematic. It's great. The goons in a Rambo movie aren't doing anything. They're just there to be shot. But it does break the sort of assumed realism of there are some tanks and some men and they're all rolling towards each other in somewhat simultaneous order.
Yeah, so to sort of maybe roll back a little bit. So the thing with an I go, you go sort of turn structure is it doesn't need rounds, because I take a turn as a player and I move all of my stuff, and then you take a turn as a player and you move all of your stuff, and why would we need a round? And this is
unless there's something in your system that requires both players have done something, now let's do a shared resolution. Yeah, without the necessity for a shared resolution step, there's nothing going on there.
Yeah, and this is what sort of creates rounds
actually, I say shared resolution, it can be just 1 millisecond later and it can be a shared initiative step. Be we do a round and then a round, and then maybe there's uncertainty about who gets the next round, as in Age of Sigmar.
Yeah. Like I say for example, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, 6th edition, where we decide initiative at the start of the game. There's a counter that says when first player has taken 6 turns, that's the last sort of set of turns of the game. But that doesn't care. It doesn't have any cleanup phase, because
that's right.
Fundamentally, we have rounds because we have cleanup phases, and sort of where we have particularly alternating activation games. So you get an alternating activation game, all the units have a go, alternating back and forth. and then we need to reset all the units so they're then allowed another go. They get a fresh set of action points, whatever it happens to be. And since we've then got to have a little box out where we go, take off all the activated tokens or whatever you did to note that the guys think the fact that everyone's gone, we've got a little box out. And then once we've got that box out, we as designers tend to go, oh, you know what, I'm going to dump a whole bunch of malarkey into that little box out. It's going to be a whole thing. I'm going to have like casualties removed during it, and fires will stop burning and poison will go off and all the, you know, baloney that we want to do. And that's going to be around, and that will be separate from a turn, and it will be separate from activation. It'll be this whole other thing. But it really is a construction of convenience for what works with a certain set of other mechanics. It's not not as like old an idea as maybe I think the idea that it's innovative to get rid of it when it's not really that old of an idea anyway, that these games should have rounds, is in a way sort of odd. And if you can do something,
well, I think the thing that's intriguing is whether you can break away from essentially the everybody gets to go paradigm, whether that's every player gets a turn or every miniature gets a turn. I think that's where interesting things start to happen. I think Infinity does an interesting job of saying, well, as an army, you generate a number of activations and you can spread those out. I think Wrath of Kings, if I recall correctly, has the sort of river, the card river activation where you can, whoever's the first card gets to activate, but you can bump the order of things around so you can kind of strategically stack what's going to happen. So I think there's lots of interesting ways of shuffling around the idea that, does everybody need to have a go? Is everybody having a go the most interesting and cinematic thing that could happen on the table? Like, does it matter that this goon at the back, you know, does something innocuous that no one cares about versus the hero with the camera on them getting to do three things? Like, it is an interesting games design question, I think.
Yeah, and I think so. I think one of the tricky things that happens, so the question is, can you elegantly like refresh the activations on the tabletop in an organic way without having this box out and going, right, end of the round, everyone gets refreshed.
Big reset button. Yeah.
And, you know, if you're doing it organically and you're doing it in a way that is player controlled, one of the things that does happen is, like you say, you get this sort of time dilation effect where time slows down in the most interesting bits of the battlefield, which on the one hand is great. That has a super sort of cinematic idea to it. You have fewer uninteresting activations potentially. You know, everyone's just going back to like what they really want to do and really want to focus on. And if somebody steps across to the other side of the table, you know, the field to activate another unit, you're like, oh my, wow, what's he doing now? He must have spotted something amazing. But if the thing that gets solved within the sort of the time dilated section that's going on that gets solved, you really can have a fat drop off in like focus and tension and interest, particularly if like everyone's fighting over one corner and then one player runs out of units in that corner, and you're suddenly like, oh, okay, right, well, your guys are all over in that corner now, and these guys are in this corner. These guys have done literally nothing all game. It's time to start yomping them across the field. It can be very tricky to moderate the rhythm and the tension and the interest in games like that, because you're letting the players sort of control where the focus is, and you know, you're letting sometimes the dice and the wounds and the activations control where the focus is, and they don't always play ball in the way that if you go, no, everybody moves across the tabletop, everybody gets to a position that if the hero dies, there's still going to be somebody stood right behind him and he's going to be in the right place and it's still going to be of worth to resolve. So
I bumped into our mate Joe and he was explaining, he explained 3 CCGs in rapid succession, so I'm not 100% sure this is the correct one that I'm pinning to, but he was explaining the like activation exchange in Digimon, where like when you play cards, that gives energy to your other player so that they can then play more cards. And I think that's an intriguing thing to dig on in an activation system where like maybe we both get an activation, let's say, and when I activate a model, whatever it does, like if it moves, the people that are near it get activation tokens if they're an enemy, or if they shoot someone, then they get an activation token. And so you could have a very fluid system where if you don't choose to flick the first domino over in like the left flank, then nothing really happens in the left flank until you start to knock over a domino. And so you could have something that was very like sort of, it's almost like pulling focus. It's like, where is the action happening? Because I flick the first domino in the center, he moves over here, so these people get an activation token and they cascade around. So I think there's definitely like the following the action metaphor feels kind of interesting, and the exchange of power or the exchange of activations I think is an interesting place to dig.
Yeah, I think it's certainly like reaction abilities and the idea of things can trigger if they can see an enemy. And so, when you step out into the open, how many activations you're giving away. Yeah, tug of war mechanics, I think, are an interesting thing to play with in relation to this. Like you say, in Digimon, you can like always cast any card in your opening hand because you always have enough energy to cast everything. It's just everything you spend. It's like literally a sort of tug of war thing. Everything you spend, it goes straight onto the other guy's meter. So if you have a massive like first turn, he's going to have a gargantuan first turn.
Yeah.
And it's a really sort of clever idea, and people love it or they don't. But I think the idea of doing that in a miniatures game where it's like it's your first turn, you've got like up to whatever 10 activation points to spend, but if you spend 10 activation points, I'm going to have 20 activation points, and if I don't spend 20 activation, if I spend 2 activation points, you'll then have 2, and you'll have 2 until I decide.
Right.
You'll get
and,
more.
and it's somewhat reflected in the Billion Suns sort of bidding system where if I go heavy on the first turn, like you've got a bit of like space where you're like, okay, so he spent 20 credits. Like I could spend 20 credits. Like it's not going to put me in a competitively bad situation if I bring out a bunch of shit at this point. But equally, if I don't, then that's kind of interesting, and I could do that.
Yeah. No.
Obviously, that doesn't interact with the activation system in the way that you've kind of posed the topic. But I guess the one other thing that I guess I'll say is that like it didn't end up having this. But the way that Perilous Tales works was originally, I wrote this exact question in my notebook about 5 years ago. And I thought, could you create a game that had a 3-act structure like a narrative in a movie did, rather than having turns? Like, is a 3-act structure something where you could change the tenor of the game? And that ended up not working in the way that I wanted on the tabletop. And so I ended up going with a turnover system, much like Blood Bowl, because I find the turnover system in Blood Bowl to be both exciting and irritating in equal measures. But in a solo game, it's just pure brilliant, because it doesn't because if you lose the game quickly, then you can re-rack, and like turning over because you made a bad flip or a bad dice roll, and then getting the game coming at you is kind of like, for me at least, like in a solo horror game, you want the game to come at you and you want it to jump. And for you to suddenly go, oh no, and then it just rip your throat out. Otherwise, it's not really doing what it's supposed to be doing. So I think a turnover system is something that, at least in activation systems, is explored a fair amount. Like Song of Blade and Song and Blades and whatever it's called, and This Is Not a Test and stuff that are sort of rooted in that idea of it comes from an uncertainty of command mechanic from historical games. I think that's the root, but I think what it ends up as being is this exact thing that you're talking about, which is I never know whether everyone's going to activate or not. And so that's not really the same as having a round in the same way. So I think that's another way to get to the same problem, which is if you want to reduce the certainty that everyone's going to get a go and change it up, then maybe have a turnover system.
Yeah, I think that rounds are a construct. They're not like an inherent sort of part of the medium. And if you can do what they do in an elegant and interesting way that isn't sort of crushing people with bookkeeping and confusing the hell out of them, I don't think there's anything to fear there. I don't think you're being wildly overly innovative. And I think it's something well worth investigating. I think there's sort of,
and we haven't even talked about simultaneous play, which honestly we've talked about a lot and cannot see the route to. But like, I'm so because in board games, simultaneous play, you know, it's never been a majority way to play, but there are a ton of good games that have simultaneous play, and there are even traditional card games that having, like, you know, I remember my very first girlfriend just kicking my ass with Slam for years. And so I do think there's something to do with, you know, simultaneous play as well, as a way of breaking through this. But I mean, I don't know. I haven't been able to write that game yet.
but yes,
I throw that gauntlet down to you all. Like, yeah, there's a great simultaneous movement activation system for miniature games, which is yet to be written, and which will probably revolutionize the genre and give us all the ability to go and make other simultaneous activation systems. So please write it, someone, please.
yes, do so. Crack on with that. But yeah, don't be afraid of dropping out rounds. Don't be afraid of finding a different way of refreshing units. Do something innovative. Get people to interact and make interesting choices in relation to what they activate when and how they activate it. And as you're doing all of those things, tell us about it in the comments section. And while you're down there, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe drop into the Discord, where this conversation has been ongoing, and there are people in there who are having conversations like this and similar to it. And would love to hear your opinion upon this idea. Smart, wise, cool people who are writing innovative and interesting games. Drop in, have conversations with them, have conversations with us. Look us up on social media, shout out to us in every possible digital and other way that you can achieve. It'd be lovely to hear from you all. But
or just watch this video and tell one friend about it. It's fine. We've got enough viewers, honestly. We don't mind.
Yes, spread the word, talk and be and live in the world, and let us know that you
do. We actually need any more viewers, Glenn? Should we have a one in, one out policy at this point?
I mean, I'm happy with the guys we've got. They're lovely. I mean, you know, I think if
I'm tempted to go exclusive.
If you're a new viewer and you didn't watch the last video, drop in the comment section, justify your presence for looking at this, and then bring at least one friend to the party and get them to do the same.
You don't have to justify your presence, but you do have to drop a comment, because the algorithm doesn't drive itself, people.
You have to justify your presence, or you have to bring us presents. But for now, it's going to be thank you and goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage. So thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye. Bye. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.